I was like, the government is about to get involved. They are about to get involved, and they are officially involved. Kathy Engelbert is officially being asked direct questions, and the answers are being demanded by congressmen. The league is in trouble. They've seen enough of the violence towards Caitlin Clark in this league, and they're done with it. They're officially done.
The United States Congress just officially intervened in the WNBA, and this isn't political theater or a suggestion. This is a formal federal demand with teeth attached. The Republican Study Committee, the largest caucus on Capitol Hill, formally requested investigations from the Department of Justice, the Department of Labor, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert has until July 24th to provide detailed answers about player safety, or she's sitting in front of cameras on national television defending why a player got one game for putting their fist in someone's throat. When the sitting president starts publicly commenting that your league treats its biggest star rather rough, and members of Congress start building a legal case about hostile work environments, you've lost control of the narrative. This isn't about basketball anymore. It's about federal workplace discrimination law. And the WNBA just became the first major sports league to face this kind of congressional pressure over on-court violence.
Where you got Trump the other day making these comments.
Young, wonderful basketball player. Caitlin, I thought that she was treated rather rough, if you want to know the truth. That was a much different kind of an event. That was a pretty bad event. But
officially, the president is now paying attention to you. I mean, yikes.
Let's be clear about what's happening here, because the language in this congressional letter is remarkably specific and purposeful. This isn't vague political posturing. Representative August P. Pfluger's statement doesn't use the kind of flowery language politicians usually hide behind. It lists concrete incidents with clinical precision. Hip checked, poked in the eye, struck in the throat. Those aren't described as basketball plays or part of the physical nature of competition. Congress explicitly uses the word violence to characterize them. And then comes the line that should genuinely terrify the WNBA's legal department. A player even appeared to endorse violence against Clark in a social media post. They're talking about Tiffany Hayes liking that fan post about "We can ride out." Congress documented it. They're putting it in official correspondence as evidence of a hostile culture surrounding these incidents. This tells you something crucial. This isn't politicians being dramatic or not understanding basketball physicality. This is lawyers building a legal case about workplace environment. The WNBA can't dismiss this as fans not understanding the game when Congress is citing specific timestamps and social media evidence as exhibits in what amounts to a federal investigation file.
Clark has been hip-checked, poked in the eye, and struck in the throat during games. The incidents go far beyond routine physical play, yet the WNBA and its officiating have too often failed to address these unacceptable incidents and hold players accountable. Recently, a player even appeared to endorse violence against Clark in a social media post. Oh, crap. Was that the Tiffany Hayes? Remember the fan said, "We can ride out," or whatever it was, and she liked the post.
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
The letter demands answers to 3 specific questions, and each one is a loaded gun pointed directly at the league's credibility. First question, what is your review mechanism for physical hostility and violence on the court? This is Congress essentially saying your current system clearly isn't working, so explain how it's supposed to function. But here's what they're really asking, why hasn't it prevented these incidents? Second question, how will you hold players accountable for overly aggressive actions, including those directed at Caitlin Clark? That's them directly saying the one-game suspension for Alyssa Thomas was inadequate, and they want to know why the league thought that was an appropriate response. Third question, what steps are you taking to protect WNBA players from online harassment and off-court threats? That's Congress acknowledging that the hostile environment extends far beyond what happens on the court. Players are being targeted on social media in public, with threats and harassment that the league apparently hasn't addressed. These aren't abstract policy questions, they're pointed challenges to the league's fundamental competence in protecting its own workforce. The July 24th deadline isn't a gentle suggestion for eventual compliance. It's a formal demand with real consequences. When Congress gives you a deadline like that, you have exactly 2 choices. Provide comprehensive, satisfactory answers by that date, or prepare to be subpoenaed to testify before Congress with cameras rolling and every major media outlet covering it live. There's no third option where you ignore this and it quietly goes away.
Oh boy, the government has noticed that. Yikes. Further fueling concerns about the culture surrounding these incidents. In addition, concerning reports suggest that many of these attacks against Caitlin Clark may be racially motivated. As commissioner, you have an obligation to ensure every player competes in a safe and professional environment, both on and off the court, free from violence, discrimination, or retaliation.
This is where things get genuinely serious for the league's legal exposure. Congress isn't framing this as a sports issue or a basketball problem. They're explicitly treating it as a civil rights matter under federal workplace discrimination law. That distinction changes absolutely everything about how this gets investigated and what consequences the league might face. Under workplace discrimination law, the investigation scope expands dramatically. Federal investigators can request documentation about league policies, communications between officials, disciplinary decisions, and patterns of conduct. They can interview players, coaches, and staff. They can examine whether the league failed to maintain a workplace free from harassment or violence based on protected characteristics. The congressional letter explicitly states that concerning reports suggest many of these attacks against Caitlin Clark may be racially motivated. That's the federal government officially putting on record that they believe a white player is being targeted because of her race in a predominantly black league. Whether that's ultimately proven true or not, the fact that Congress is saying it out loud in official correspondence fundamentally changes the entire conversation. It means any future physical play involving Caitlin Clark will be scrutinized through a racial lens. It means the WNBA can't dismiss concerns about her treatment as fans being overly protective or simply not understanding basketball. It means race is now officially part of a federal investigation into league conduct.
Number 1. What is your review mechanism for physical hostility and violence on the court? ? How will you hold players accountable for overly aggressive actions on the court, including towards Caitlin Clark? ? What steps are you taking to protect the WNBA players from online harassment and off-court threats? ? We are members of the Republican Study Committee, the largest caucus on Capitol Hill, and we are committed to strengthening families and protecting opportunities for women.
If you thought this was just congressional pressure, consider what happened when President Trump publicly commented on Caitlin Clark's treatment. He called her a young, wonderful basketball player and said he thought she was treated rather rough. He called it a much different kind of an event and characterized it as a pretty bad event. Now, here's why that matters beyond just a politician making a comment. When the sitting president of the United States starts using words like rough and bad event to describe how your league treats its biggest star, you've lost control of the narrative. The conversation has moved from sports media into the political mainstream. Trump's comments came days before the congressional letter went public, which means Republican lawmakers were already coordinating their response. They watched the Alyssa Thomas incident. They watched the one-game suspension. They watched multiple other incidents go inadequately addressed, and they collectively decided the WNBA's internal accountability system wasn't working. So they started building a file. They documented incidents, timestamps, social media posts, league responses, and disciplinary outcomes. Then they formally presented it to the federal government, and the sitting president started talking about it publicly. That's a coordinated political response at the highest levels of government. The league isn't dealing with isolated criticism anymore. It's dealing with sustained federal attention from multiple branches of government simultaneously.
The Engelbert, Adam Silver, you are officially on notice. You have officially been put on notice by members of our government. I saw this coming a mile away because I was like, I'm going to tell you when I saw it coming. When they handed Alyssa Thomas a one-game suspension, I said, oh shit, the government's about to get involved in this. Because that's a bullshit suspension. It does nothing. It flexes no muscle as a league at all.
You need to understand what Congress is actually responding to because it's not one incident. It's a pattern. Caitlin Clark has been hip-checked away from the ball when she wasn't even involved in the play. She's been poked in the eye. She's been struck in the throat. These incidents happened repeatedly throughout the season, and the league's responses were consistently inadequate. Kennedy Carter delivered a hip check that looked deliberate and was completely away from any basketball action. The league suspended her for one game. Alyssa Thomas struck Clark in the throat while also driving her knee toward Clark's groin during the playoffs. The punishment, 1 game. Janet Carrington poked Clark in the eye. Minimal consequences. Marina Mabury slammed into Clark on the side in a way that looked more like intentional contact than competitive play. The pattern was obvious to anyone watching. The incidents weren't isolated incidents. They were recurring problems that the league kept minimizing. And then there's the social media component that Congress specifically mentioned. Tiffany Hayes, a WNBA player, liked a fan post that read, "We can ride out," essentially endorsing violent action against Clark. Congress documented this. They're citing it in official federal correspondence. This tells you they're not just looking at on-court conduct. They're examining the broader culture within the league. They're asking whether there's a systemic tolerance for or even encouragement of physical violence directed at one specific player. That's why this moved from a sports story to a federal civil rights investigation.
1 game suspension. I said, the government's about to get involved in this. Because people can watch the NBA and we can see with our own eyes what physical basketball and actual basketball plays look like. And then we can see a lot of things that clearly are not part of the game. It's no matter how much the left-wing media wants to act like, oh, those are basketball plays. Marina Mabury slamming into the side of Caitlin.
There's a moment in this story where everything changed. It's the moment the WNBA handed Alyssa Thomas a 1-game suspension for conduct that involved putting a fist in someone's throat and a knee in their groin area. That single decision essentially told the federal government that the WNBA either couldn't or wouldn't protect its players from serious physical assault disguised as basketball. And that's when Congress started paying attention. Multiple observers saw this coming the moment that suspension was announced. 1 game for what millions of viewers watched in real time looked like deliberate targeted violence with nothing to do with making an actual basketball play. When a league demonstrates that it won't police itself, external authorities start asking whether they need to step in. That's exactly what happened here. Congress watched the WNBA handle the Thomas incident with what they clearly viewed as inadequate discipline, and they decided the league had lost the privilege of self-governance on this particular issue. The federal government was now involved because the WNBA's own actions invited that involvement. People can watch the NBA and see what actual physical basketball looks like. They can see what legitimate hard fouls look like. Then they can watch the WNBA and see things that clearly are not part of the game, and no amount of left-wing or right-wing media framing changes what their eyes are seeing. Congress saw those same things, they watched the league's response, and they decided it was inadequate.
We watch it, the hatefulness, it's ugly, and I knew this was coming. I was like, the league really isn't going to do anything until the government steps in. Is that what's happened? Congratulations, you're on Trump's radar. Woo! That's not the radar you want to be on. You want him to make more comments? Do you want him to start asking more and more questions? This is very interesting.
This date isn't arbitrary. It's not a casual suggestion for when the league might want to provide some answers. July 24th is the line in the sand that separates private negotiation from public spectacle. Here's what Congress is essentially saying. You have until this specific date to provide us with detailed, comprehensive, satisfactory answers about your player safety mechanisms and accountability procedures. If those answers are satisfactory, we might not need to schedule hearings. We might not need to subpoena your commissioner. We might not need to make this a public congressional spectacle with cameras and media and national television coverage. But if your answers aren't satisfactory, or if you try to delay or minimize your response, prepare for the worst-case scenario. And that worst case is genuinely catastrophic. Imagine Kathy Angelbert sitting at a table with a microphone in front of her, members of Congress on either side, and national television cameras broadcasting live. They're asking her to explain on national television why Alyssa Thomas only received 1 game for conduct they're explicitly characterizing as assault. They're asking her to explain the pattern of incidents directed at Caitlin Clark and why players faced minimal consequences. They're asking her whether she believes race played a role in those attacks and what evidence she has that would support that conclusion. That hearing would be carried live on every sports network and news channel in America. It would be clipped and shared millions of times across social media. There's no version of that hearing where the WNBA comes out looking competent or in control. This deadline is Congress giving the league one chance to handle this privately and competently. If they fail that test, they're going to handle it publicly and humiliatingly.
Congratulations, you reap what you sow. here we are. Tell me what you think. Hit subscribe. The shit has hit the fan. Peace. I'm out.
Here's what makes this situation genuinely nightmarish for the WNBA. This issue went mega viral across conservative outlets and mainstream networks, but was largely avoided by left-leaning media. That creates a specific political reality where Republicans see defending Caitlin Clark as popular with their base, while Democrats are reluctant to engage because it involves complex conversations about race and sports culture that nobody wants to have. So the WNBA finds itself in a position where one major political party is aggressively investigating them with federal resources, and the other party isn't particularly motivated to defend them. That's a nightmare scenario for any organization that needs to maintain good relationships with federal lawmakers. The league can't afford to have this become a partisan issue, where Republicans are positioned as protecting a white star from a predominantly black league, while Democrats stay silent. But that's exactly the dynamic that's developing. It's forcing conversations about race that typically get avoided in sports media, except now those conversations are happening in congressional offices with lawyers present. The WNBA can't defend itself by claiming this is a basketball issue because Congress has already reframed it as a civil rights issue. They can't dismiss concerns by saying critics don't understand the game because Congress has explicitly cited specific incidents and timestamps. They can't minimize the social media endorsement of violence because it's now documented in official federal correspondence. They're trapped between accepting federal scrutiny or looking like they're defying Congress on a civil rights matter. There's no winning move in that scenario. The WNBA has 3 realistic paths forward, and every single one involves significant reputational damage. Option 1. Provide comprehensive answers to Congress that actually satisfy their concerns. This likely means admitting that their previous disciplinary actions were inadequate, announcing major policy changes to their officiating and accountability systems, and essentially throwing their own systems under the bus. They'd have to acknowledge that they got it wrong, that their responses to incidents were insufficient, and that they're now going to fundamentally change how they operate. That's politically difficult because it requires the league to essentially confess to incompetence or negligence. It undermines the authority of everyone in the league office who made those original decisions. It gives ammunition to critics who have been calling out the league's failures all season, but it also might satisfy Congress and prevent public hearings. Option 2. Provide defensive answers that justify their current approach and try to convince Congress that the league is handling things appropriately. But here's the problem with that strategy. Congress has already documented the incidents, reviewed the disciplinary responses, and decided those responses are inadequate. If the league tries to defend decisions that Congress has already concluded are insufficient, that almost certainly leads to congressional hearings where they have to defend the one-game suspension on national television. That's even worse because it extends the news cycle indefinitely, makes the league look both incompetent and defiant, and gives Congress ammunition for more aggressive questioning. Option 3. Try to delay or minimize their response, hope this blows over or claim they need more time to investigate. That's the worst possible strategy because it guarantees subpoenas and hostile hearings. Congress will view it as the league trying to evade accountability, and they'll respond with formal subpoenas that carry legal penalties for noncompliance. There's no good option here. Every path forward involves significant damage to the league's reputation and credibility with federal lawmakers. Here's something the WNBA leadership might not fully appreciate yet. Federal investigations into workplace safety fundamentally change how organizations operate, and they do it at a systemic level. If the WNBA is genuinely worried about DOJ or EEOC investigations into whether they're maintaining a hostile work environment, they're going to start calling games very differently. Suddenly, every hard foul gets reviewed. Every physical altercation gets escalated. Players who have been getting away with extra contact and aggressive play find themselves getting technical fouls and suspensions for conduct that was previously tolerated. The entire culture of physical play in the league shifts because the legal and political risks of another viral incident become too high. The league can't afford another moment where millions of people watch something on their screens and think the league didn't take it seriously, so officiating becomes hyper-aggressive. Risk aversion becomes policy, and the competitive nature of the league changes as a result. Now some fans will say that's exactly what needed to happen, that the league needed external pressure to clean up genuinely dangerous play and create a safer environment. Others will argue it turns the WNBA into an over-officiated mess, where players can't compete physically without fear of federal workplace discrimination complaints. Both arguments have validity. But the point is that federal investigation doesn't just affect the league office. It affects every single game, every official's decision-making, and every player's understanding of what physical contact is acceptable. That's a massive systemic change driven entirely by external pressure. Think about what this means for the players who have been involved in physical altercations with Caitlin Clark this season. Kennedy Carter, who delivered that hip check away from the ball. Alyssa Thomas, who struck Clark in the throat. Jani Carrington, who poked her in the eye, Marina Mabury, and others involved in other incidents. These players are now potentially subjects of federal workplace discrimination investigations. Their conduct is being reviewed not just by league officials making disciplinary decisions, but potentially by Department of Justice attorneys looking for evidence of racially motivated hostility. That's a massive escalation that goes way beyond basketball discipline. Federal investigators can request documentation about their communications. They can examine their social media activity looking for patterns that might suggest bias or targeted behavior. They can interview teammates, coaches, and staff members about whether these players have expressed any biased views or whether there's a pattern of behavior directed specifically at one player. Even if nothing ultimately comes from those investigations, the process itself is invasive and damaging to these players' careers and reputations. They're being branded as potentially part of a hostile work environment investigation. Future employers, sponsors, and teams will see their names attached to federal investigations into racial discrimination. These players didn't set out to become subjects of a federal civil rights investigation, but that's exactly what's happening because of repeated incidents and the league's inadequate responses to them. ESPN and other media companies that have invested in WNBA coverage are having very different conversations right now. ESPN has built their programming strategy around the WNBA's growth narrative. They've invested significant resources in broadcast coverage, streaming rights, and original content. But when a league becomes associated with congressional investigations into racial discrimination and workplace violence, that's not the kind of story that attracts casual viewers or convinces major advertisers to spend money. Networks want to cover inspiring athletes in competitive games. They want to build narratives about growth and progress and exciting young talent. They don't want to cover federal investigations and hostile work environment complaints and civil rights allegations. If the league's brand becomes politically toxic or legally complicated, that affects the economics of sports broadcasting. No major network wants to be in business with an organization that's under active investigation by multiple federal agencies for civil rights violations. That becomes a liability. That becomes a PR problem for the broadcaster themselves. This could genuinely impact the WNBA's ability to negotiate favorable media rights deals in the future. If ESPN or other broadcasters decide the league is too legally risky or politically charged, the league loses bargaining power. They might get offered less money for media rights. They might have fewer potential partners willing to broadcast their games. The economic model of professional sports relies on sustained media coverage and advertising revenue. If that dries up because the league is under federal investigation, the financial model of the league itself becomes unstable. The absolute worst thing about this timing is that it's destroying momentum the league was finally building. Caitlin Clark's rookie season brought millions of new fans who'd never watched women's basketball before. Ratings were breaking records. Attendance was setting new highs. The league was finally positioned to capitalize on sustained mainstream attention heading into the next season. The growth trajectory was real. The investment in the league was increasing. Sponsors were becoming more interested. Media outlets were giving the WNBA more coverage. Everything was pointing toward the league finally achieving the mainstream recognition it had been building toward for years. And then instead of that momentum carrying into the offseason, the dominant story becomes congressional investigations and workplace violence and racial discrimination allegations. That narrative completely overwhelms any positive coverage the league might generate. Every story about the WNBA's growth now has to include paragraphs about the federal investigation. Every profile of young stars has to address the controversy around physical play and player safety. The league's brand is being defined by its worst moments instead of its best ones. Casual fans who were just starting to become interested in the league are now reading about federal civil rights investigations. Potential new viewers are seeing headlines about congressional hearings instead of stories about exciting basketball. The positive momentum that took years to build is being destroyed in a matter of weeks because of how the league handled discipline. Here's the most frustrating part of this entire situation. This was completely preventable. All of this could have been avoided if the league had taken the initial concerns seriously and imposed meaningful discipline from the start. If Kennedy Carter had received a meaningful suspension after that hip check, that would have sent a clear message about what kind of conduct the league wouldn't tolerate. If Alyssa Thomas had received a multi-game suspension or removal from the playoffs for the throat strike incident, that would have demonstrated the league takes player safety seriously and is willing to enforce that standard. If the league had issued statements taking a hard stance against physical violence and followed through with consequences that actually meant something, this story never escalates to congressional involvement. But instead, the WNBA consistently minimized these incidents. They handed out token suspensions that looked more like scheduling adjustments than actual consequences. They acted like critics were being overly dramatic or didn't understand basketball. They treated concerns about player safety as if they were overreactions from people who didn't get the game. That approach worked fine when it was just fans and sports media complaining. You can ignore critical media coverage and dismiss fan complaints if you don't agree with them. But once the incidents got bad enough and frequent enough and visible enough that members of Congress started paying attention, suddenly, the league's permissive approach to physical violence became a federal issue. The WNBA created this situation entirely through its own inadequate responses. Congress is involved because the league demonstrated it wouldn't handle the problem internally. Best case scenario for the WNBA. They provide detailed answers to Congress by July 24th. Those answers satisfy congressional concerns. They announce major changes to their disciplinary and officiating procedures. They implement new player safety protocols, and Congress accepts that as sufficient action. The investigations get dropped or quietly closed. The news cycle moves on to other stories. The league spends next season proving they've actually changed their approach. That's the best case, and it still involves significant public embarrassment, admissions of past failures, and policy changes the league didn't want to make forced upon them by federal pressure. They still lose the narrative. They still have to rebuild their reputation. Worst case scenario. The WNBA's answers don't satisfy Congress. The responses seem defensive or inadequate. Congress schedules public hearings. Kathy Angelbert has to testify on national television defending decisions that even the league office probably knows were insufficient. The DOJ and EEOC launch formal investigations. Federal attorneys start requesting documents and taking depositions. The league spends the next year dealing with federal scrutiny while trying to play basketball games and grow their viewership. Sponsors start reconsidering their involvement. Media partners get nervous. The league's credibility is shattered. That's catastrophic for the league's long-term viability. Reality is probably somewhere in between. Congress will get their answers. The WNBA will make some changes. There will be ongoing scrutiny, but probably not full federal investigations unless more incidents occur. But regardless of what actually happens, the damage is already done in terms of how the league is perceived. The WNBA is now the league that needed federal government intervention to protect its biggest star from on-court violence. That's the reputation they'll be fighting against for years. Every time there's a hard foul or physical altercation, people will reference this moment when the federal government had to step in. The league's credibility on player safety issues is permanently damaged. And all of that was avoidable if they'd just taken the initial concerns seriously and imposed appropriate discipline when these incidents first started happening. The clock is ticking toward July 24th. Congress is waiting. The federal agencies are waiting. President Trump has already commented publicly, which means this isn't going away quietly. The WNBA is entering the most critical moment in its relationship with federal government, and the outcome of how they respond will define the league for years to come. There's a bigger question here beyond just the WNBA's immediate response. This is about what happens when federal government decides to get involved in sports. It's about the precedent being set for other leagues and other issues. It's about whether federal intervention actually improves player safety or just creates risk aversion and over-officiating. It's about whether having Congress treating sports as a civil rights issue actually solves the underlying problems or just politicizes everything. And it's about whether the WNBA can survive being the test case for all of this. The players involved in these incidents have to be concerned about what federal investigations mean for their careers and futures. The league office has to be concerned about what public testimony means for their jobs and credibility. The media partners have to be concerned about what association with a league under federal investigation means for their own brands. Everyone involved in this situation is dealing with consequences they didn't anticipate when they made those original disciplinary decisions. What do you think should happen next? Should Congress follow through with hearings if the WNBA's answers aren't satisfactory? Should the DOJ and EEOC launch formal investigations? Or is the threat of federal involvement enough to force the changes that need to happen? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this story is far from over and we're going to be covering every development as it happens. Make sure you're subscribed because the next few weeks will define this league's future.